a soil scientist and educator who studies soil ecology in coastal California bioregions and advocates for soil conservation and care. She's an assistant professor of soil science and restoration ecology at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where she teaches a variety of soil science and ecology courses and leads the Central Coast Soil Horizons and Ecology Lab, or Seashell. Yamita receives a PhD in ecology from Colorado State University and a BS in environmental management and protection from Cal Poly. She can often be found exploring soils, looking for birds, and drawing along the coast. She also writes about soil science and conversation topics if anyone is curious about more soils. Obviously, you can ask her more questions at the end of the lecture. And if you guys have any questions about signing up for the newsletter, if you guys aren't already signed up, please ask me at the end of the lecture. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to hand it to you now.
All right, thank you so much, Chrissy. Hello, everyone. I so appreciate you coming out on a Wednesday night to join us here in the Natural History Museum. How awesome is this? I am really happy to be able to share some of my passion and interest about soils, soil science, and particularly the soils that we can find here along the coast. So my goal is to convince you that soils are this beautiful part of nature that are worth thinking a little bit more about, and that they're worth finding next time you're out on a walk in nature. So I am, like Chrissy said, I'm an assistant professor of soil science and restoration ecology at Cal Poly, which means I have the great pleasure of teaching all about soils and ecology, and we're lucky here in San Luis Obispo to be able to live in a place where we have access to so many beautiful natural spaces. And so today's talk is really a celebration of the soils in the Central Coast. And I want to start with an image of what many of us might think of when we think of the word soil. And actually, when you Google soil, this is what happens, what comes up. You know, you might get a picture of potting soil that looks like this, where we've got this fluffy brown material and a little sprout that comes out. And this is the picture that many of us might have in our mind when we think about soil. And before I started studying soil science as an undergraduate, I just thought soil was this pile of brown stuff outside where plants grow. I didn't really know much about it. I didn't really have a concept of what soil is, what it means, and why it's so important. And now, in my years of becoming a soil scientist and spending so much of my life thinking about soils, I see soils as something that looks more like this. And so as soil scientists, we study the diversity of different soil types and forms and functions, and we use our understanding of the way that soils form to inform how we might manage and conserve those soils in the future. And most of the time, when you hear about soils in the context of science communication, or when you read about soils in the media, for example, those conversations are typically framed around agriculture. Like, how can we get more or extract more out of our soils to be able to support our food systems? And it's true that soils support this important ecosystem service of being able to support our food systems, but soils are so much more than that. Another way that we often hear about soils is in the context of climate change. And it's true that a lot of our nature-based solutions to climate also are held within the soil. But in order to be able to think about soil through these different lenses and allow soils to provide those ecosystem services, we first need to have a relationship with them. We need to know what they are, how they form, and how they function. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And so soil, as a concept, is this material that sits at this environmental interface. So we use the term pedosphere for thinking about soils because the pedosphere is at the interface of the biosphere, so plants and animals up at the surface, the hydrosphere, water moving through the soil, the lithosphere, which is rocks underlying the soil from which they weather, and of course the atmosphere, also the air. And so when we're thinking about any kind of environmental challenge, or really anything about the environment, it always connects back to the soil in some way, because soil sits at the intersection of all of these different aspects of the environment. And so when we're asking questions about biodiversity, about biology, about hydrology, often the answer lies in soils. But because soils are this environmental interface, they're complex and they're dynamic and they change over time. And so like I mentioned earlier, soils can provide and do provide these fundamental ecosystem services. So why do soils matter? Well, they matter because they support our food systems, like I said. They also help regulate our climate. They regulate nutrient cycling and decomposition. They create habitat for organisms, and I'll show you some photos of that in just a minute. there are so many different things that soils provide to humanity, and this concept of ecosystem services is really an anthropocentric idea. And what I mean by that is that an ecosystem service is something that the environment provides to humanity. And soils do so many of these different things, and so it's important that we're able to conserve and restore soils so that they can continue to provide these ecosystem services. But in order to be able to do that, we need to get to know them first. And so I want to highlight a couple of things, a couple of these ecosystem services, because I imagine that many of you are naturalists or like spending time outside. Is that true for anybody? Okay, so for many of us, we are drawn to the beauty and diversity of plants, right? So soils, of course, support this biodiversity around the world. This is a picture from Death Valley National Park, which is one of my favorite places, in addition to the Central Coast, that has been blooming for the last several months in the Panamint Valley here. And if it weren't for soils providing this medium for plant growth, we wouldn't be able to have this great diversity of plants that we see around the world. Soils also support habitat for wildlife. So here's just a couple of examples. We've got our cute little ground squirrel at the top. This is the photo I'm most excited about. I am also a birder in addition to being a soil scientist, and I recently got into bird photography. And I love the burrowing owl because it's a soil bird. How great is that? So soils create habitat for wildlife, and understanding how soils can support these ecosystems is important not just for the soils themselves, but also for the organisms that they support. And it turns out that soils are one of the most biodiverse habitats on Earth. This is a photo from a paper that came out, I guess, 10 years ago now, but I love it because it shows the huge diversity of different organisms that live within the soil. Now, some of these might be familiar to you, like the earthworm, or perhaps fungi and bacteria, but some of the organisms that live in the soil might be ones that you haven't spent much time with, like these cute little springtails, these collembola here, or mites and nematodes up here on the top. And then this is a tardigrade, also known as the internet's favorite soil organism. And so these are small soil animals that live within water films and mosses in soils and wetlands and things like that. And so what I want you to notice about this here is that not only are soils one of the most biodiverse habitats, but that biodiversity crosses a lot of spatial scales. So you have organisms that live in the soil that are single cellular, that are tiny. You also have organisms that live in the soil that are large, megafauna. And all of those organisms are interacting with one another in these complex soil food webs from which important ecosystem services like decomposition arise. And so soils create habitat for other organisms above ground, plants, wildlife, like I mentioned earlier, but they also create habitat for organisms below ground too. And so in my research group at Cal Poly, we spend a lot of time thinking about the organisms that live in the soil, what they do, why they matter, how they function, and how our management influences those organisms as well. I'm not going to talk about that too much today. We'll save that for another Mind Walk in the future. One of the reasons that soils are so important is because we're standing in a time where society is facing these unprecedented environmental challenges. Whether that be the loss of biodiversity, land degradation writ large, the climate crisis, all of these things are impacting soils' ability to support habitat, to provide those ecosystem services that I mentioned earlier. And we often look to soils as being a solution to many of these challenges. So in the climate crisis space, or climate change space, we often think about soils as a mechanism for nature-based solutions. So how can we support soils to store more carbon in the ground to mitigate the amount of atmospheric CO2 that is causing climate change? And so there's lots of ways that soils can support our ability to find solutions to these environmental challenges. But I think that it's important that we know what soils are and are able to see how they interact with our own lives on a day-to-day before we can think about them as solutions to these grand challenges. So to conserve soils, so that they can support all these ecosystem services, we must be able to see them first. And as many of you know, as you have had personal experiences with nature, when you learn more about something in the natural world, then you start to see it in different ways. This is something that I experienced a lot, of course, when I started studying soils more, but even more recently when I started birding. it was like once I started to learn a couple of my local birds, it completely changed my experience with being outside. I would notice the vultures, I would notice the black phoebe on the fence, and I would get to know the personality of these different birds, and it just made me feel more connected to this place in this time. And I think that so often soils are framed as something that we can continue to extract from, a natural resource that is a place that humanity can gain some value from. And while that's true in some sense, because soils are important for all of these ecosystem processes, it's also true that soils are a beautiful part of nature. And what I hope you walk away from tonight's talk is a new set of eyes to be able to see and experience soils in a different way. And so I'm going to show you a couple of the tools that soil scientists use to be able to get to know soils. And then I'm going to share 3 different soils in local state parks here, 2 of which are within walking distance from this very location right now, that I hope to inspire you to go check out and explore some of the soils that we have around here locally. All right, so like I mentioned, I really deeply feel like soils are this beautiful part of nature that are worth celebrating. And in addition to my life as a soil scientist and an educator, I also dabble in making art. So these are a couple of my paintings here. This I did not paint, this is a photo. But the other 2 are some paintings of what we call a soil profile. And I'll introduce that concept of a soil profile in just a little bit. But a lot of my goal here is to help us think about soils as this whimsical part of nature that is worth celebrating beyond just being a natural resource from which we can extract. So I like to think about soils as a natural wonder as much as I like to think about them in the context of ecosystem services. Am I going too fast? I get excited. Okay, so lucky for us, we live in a place where we are surrounded by both rare and endangered soil types. So this is a study from 20 years ago now that already was able to categorize some soil types as becoming endangered due to urbanization. And so what that means is we have a diversity of different kinds of soils that form in different ways that we'll get to. But urbanization, human expansion, and agriculture have led to a loss of some of those unique soil types. And so this is a map here. I know the colors are a little bit hard to see, but it's a map of the US. And if we focus on California here, the pink areas are areas where we have endangered soil types. And this was from 20 years ago, but if we were to update this map, those areas might be even larger as urbanization and human domination of the environment has continued. And so here in California, we have rare and endangered soil types that arise from our unique combination of different geologies, different climates, and the topography that we are lucky to experience here in the state. And it turns out the soils in San Luis Obispo are very diverse. So these are 4 photos of soils from around here. This one's from along the coast. The rest of them are on properties on or nearby Cal Poly's campus. And I want you to notice just the variety of different colors. We've got yellow and red and orange, white, black. You can see all the colors out there. This is the kind of diversity that I think should be celebrated. Because one of the things that got me excited about soils in the first place when I was really first starting out is the fact that soils can be found in so many different colors. Like, I didn't realize that there was such a diversity of different soil types. And as soon as you start to dig deeper, literally, you can get a different perspective of the diversity of soils in San Luis Obispo. And so the question is why? Why are there so many different types of soils in this area? Why are there so many different types of soils in California? And the answer is because soils arise from the interaction between what we call the soil forming factors. Now the soil forming factors are these broad concepts, or I guess factors is the best term. These are the things that create the unique soil types that we see. So this is some artwork by a colleague and friend of mine, Lewis, and it describes this equation that we use in soil science to explain why there's a diversity of different soil types. So the equation here is that soils, this is our soil here, it looks like something out of Minecraft, is a function of these different factors. The first one being climate, the second one being organisms, a little earthworm and otherwise. We've also got topography, so the lay of the land surface. The pile there represents paramaterial or the underlying geology, and then of course time. And so these soil forming factors interact with one another to create the unique types of soils that we see. So let me give you an example. Here in San Luis Obispo, we have a Mediterranean climate, and if we're working in a grassland or studying a grassland, for example, the plants that exist in that soil are going to influence the amount of organic matter that gets into the soil. The underlying geology is going to influence the color and the texture and the shape of that soil. So all of these things interact to make every single soil that we observe unique in some way. And so soil scientists are really interested in isolating each of these variables to be able to explore how only climate influences the properties of a soil profile, and we do that sort of iteratively for each of the ones here. And so in San Luis Obispo, like I mentioned, we have these diverse different kinds of soils, in large part because we have diverse geologies here in the county. And this is what's called a block diagram. Have you ever seen a diagram that maybe looks like this? Some nods. So a block diagram essentially is a conceptual diagram that helps us visualize and understand how the different kinds of underlying rock and parent materials intersect across a landscape. So here out in Morro Bay, we're close to the ocean here. So we've got along the coast, we have these marine terraces and different marine terrace and beach deposits along the coast. And then as you get further and further back, we've got a complex amalgamation of different kinds of rocks that weather into sediments that eventually become soil. So this geologic diversity is called the Franciscan melange. We've got shales and sandstones and also some serpentinite soils here that's represented in this little section back here. So there's lots of different kinds of underlying rocks, and as those rocks weather and decompose and break apart into individual sediments, they become diverse soils. So today, I'm going to focus on a couple of soils that I'll show you that are kind of down in this area because we're right by the beach, we're right by the ocean. But the soils of San Luis Obispo County are diverse and unique, in large part because we have lots of different kinds of parent materials or original material that creates the soil itself. So those parent materials become soil through what we call the soil forming processes. And so these soil forming processes are the things that act upon that parent material to create the soil forms that we see in nature. This is a diagram that indicates those four general broad processes. We have things that come into the soil, additions. That might be like rain or snow or an animal burrowing through the soil. It might be plant roots or plants material that's deposited from the surface. It could be erosion that's coming from down the slope, from higher up in the slope. So there are materials that come into the soil. There's also materials that leave the soil, whether that be water that's leaching down through the soil profile and out into the groundwater. It could be erosional losses on the other end. And so there are constantly things that are coming into the soil and leaving the soil that create the soil environment in a unique way. Within the soil profile, there's also translocations and transformations. Translocations are processes that move material throughout the soil, whether that be up and down, side to side. And then transformations are chemical transformations that occur within the soil, like decomposition and weathering, for example. And so all of these four processes act on that diverse geology to create unique different soil types. And depending on the climate or the topography where a given soil is, that's going to influence the degree to which each of these processes is occurring. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that a little bit later. So as a result of this, soils are dynamic across space and across time. Soils are often, it's easy for us to visualize them as being static because they're often overlooked and sort of hidden from view, so it seems like the soil isn't changing that much. But actually, soils are dynamic on the order of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, and they also vary quite a bit across space. So to give you an example of how different soils can look depending on where you are, here are two examples. The top is a soil in North Carolina. This is the soil here. You can see that it's very rocky all the way up to the surface and has a little bit of soil on top there. And this is on a steep hillside in North Carolina. So this is the landscape that's associated with the soil underneath. If you go all the way to the other side of the country and you end up in Alaska, you can see that the landscape looks completely different. The vegetation is different. Of course, the climate is different. And the soil looks completely different as a result. This is actually a layer of permafrost here. Permafrost is permanent consecutive years. And then we've got this thick horizon on the surface that's got all of this organic matter accumulating that isn't decomposing because it's so cold and it's so wet. So soil scientists are interested in understanding why are these soils different, and it often comes back to the soil forming factors. So the reason that these are different is likely because they have different climates, they've got different underlying geologies, and they're at different landscape positions, and so on and so forth. So how do soil scientists go about studying these kinds of diverse, different kinds of soils? And so what we do is we will go out into the field and we will focus on what we call the soil profile. And I've used that term a little bit, but I want to explain what it means now. The soil profile is basically the horizontal or vertical cross-section of a soil. It's like a straight-on view of a soil that reveals the horizons or layers underneath. This is an example of a rather chaotic soil profile from Alaska. And the reason that there's all these little bits and pieces of different types of soil material that are mixed around all together is because this soil in Alaska has undergone lots of what we call cryoturbation, which is basically this mixing turbation that occurs because the soil gets frozen and then it thaws, and then it freezes and then it thaws. And so cryoturbation is a mixing of the soil material because of this freeze-thaw action. So that has to do with the climate. But this is a pretty special case. So I wanted to show you that because I think it's a unique example. But most of the time, our soil profiles look something a bit more like this, where we've got these horizons that appear in the soil. This is a soil that is forming in the floodplain of the Mississippi River in Wisconsin. And it's a beautiful, charismatic one, if you ask me. But the soil profile is what we think of as the basic unit of investigation for a soil scientist. So when a soil scientist begins to study a new system or a new site, we first go to the soil profile to understand the process of how that soil forms. And so when we're looking at a soil profile like this, what we're really trying to use the soil profile to do is to approximate this three-dimensional space. So this diagram shows how the soil profile is actually connected to the rest of the soil in the landscape. And so when we think about a three-dimensional space like this, we call that a pedon. And then multiple pedons that are all kind of interlinked and next to each other across a landscape is called a polypedon. So soil scientists will dig a hole, and we will expose the soil profile, measure its properties, collect soil samples, and we'll do that across a landscape to be able to interpret how that soil formed, how it got there, and how it might respond to management or changes in the future. And so the reason that this soil has all of these different layers or horizons is because this soil is in a floodplain. And so that means that every time the Mississippi River floods, it will deposit that new material on top. And then that new material is exposed to these soil-forming processes like those additions, losses, transformations, and translocations that I mentioned before. And soils will kind of grow and expand and change over time. And so if you notice, my favorite feature of this soil here, if I can just take a little detour, is this darker horizon down there. Did you notice that? Yes? Okay. So this is what's called a buried soil horizon. So it used to be at the surface. Plants were growing at the surface. When plants grow in a soil, they deposit organic material into the soil. That organic matter is a pigmenting agent, and so it gives the soil a darker color. And then what happened here with this soil is there was a flood, new material was deposited on top, and then that buried horizon is left underneath. So I think that's pretty cool. Because when you look at a soil profile like this and you understand the processes by which soils form, you can use a feature like this, like the color of that horizon there, to infer how the soil might have gotten there or formed in the first place. So those are the kinds of inferences that we're trying to make. And so in order to do that, we make lots of different measurements, and we make observations about what the soil looks like, how it feels. And one of the main ones, one of the most striking soil features is the color of the soil. And so this is an example of, these are my hands, and holding a soil in Texas that I love. So before I came back to Cal Poly, I was a research associate at Texas A&M for a little while. And this was a soil that has a really high water table. And because of that high water table, there are chemical reactions that occur with the iron in the soil that create this kind of patchwork of soil color. It's called mottling. M-O-T-T-L-I-N-G. ecology, not strike opposed modeling. And these colors occur because there are places where the iron is reduced, that creates the gray color. There's also places where the iron is oxidized, like rust, so it creates that rusty color. And the reason that the soil is all patchy like this is because the water table goes up and down and up and down and up and down seasonally. And so the water dynamics create or change the conditions in the soil to the extent to which it changes the color of the soil. On the other side here, this is an example of a Munsell color book, and this is actually Cody's hands, who's here right now. He's here in the back representing. And so we use this Munsell color book here to describe the color of the soil. This is actually a rock Munsell color book, so we use the same kind of little color chips to describe the colors of rocks as we do to describe the colors of the soil. But it's a fun exercise because it's basically like taking little paint chips. Like, have you ever gone to Ace Hardware and just stood there in front of the paint chips and said, "This is awesome"? That's what I do on the weekend. So it's like having a book of paint chips, and you're flipping through it, and you have your little bit of soil or rock or whatever you're trying to describe the color, and you put it behind and you try to match it to the color. And we can use that color to make inferences about how that soil formed because we have studied the diversity of different soil colors across the globe. So here's an example. These are photos from John Kelly, who is a retired soil scientist with the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. If you want to go on a deep dive, I highly recommend his Flickr account. He has so many great photos of soil. But anyways, this is just an example of the diversity of different soil colors that we might find. So red and white and orange and blue. And we can use those colors to learn more about where that soil came from. And that's because the minerals in the soil that weather from rocks are pigmenting agents. So the reason that soils are different colors is basically three reasons. Reason number one is because the rocks from which they are derived are different colors. So if we can look at the color of a soil, that can help us understand what kinds of rocks they may have weathered from. Number two is because organic matter, like I mentioned earlier, is also a pigmenting agent. So the amount of organic matter in the soil will also change its color. So you tend to find darker soil colors, darker browns and blacks when you have a lot of organic matter. And then the third reason that soil color varies is because the conditions of the soil are different, like that water table example that I gave you earlier, where a soil might be more wet or a soil might be more dry or something like that. So the conditions of the soil will also influence the color. And so this is an example of common pigmenting agents in soil. This is the notation that we use to describe soil color in soil science. If we want to think more about that, we can talk about it after. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the notation here. But essentially it describes the dominant spectral signature of the soil color, how light or how dark it is, and how saturated that color is. So if you've ever taken a photo on your phone and then tried to edit it and then turned up the saturation a lot, those are the kinds of measurements that we're trying to make in the soil. So how saturated is the color, how light or dark it is, and then is it more yellowish, is it more reddish, is it more blue, etc. So soil color is one feature that we use to help us infer how a soil got there. Another feature is the shape, or what we call the structure of the soil. So when you start to look at soil profiles and get to know them a little bit more, you'll notice that they're not just a flat sheet. They have a physical architecture, they have a shape, and we call that a soil structure. And so if you notice here in this soil, you can see that these are kind of like square blocks. So the reason that soil particles stick together like that is because there's a lot of clay. Those clays are sticky, and they will create these repeating structures within the soil. This is just a cute one. That's not a commonly occurring soil structure, but I love that photo. This is the kind of soil structure that we get a lot out here in San Luis Obispo, where we have soils that are weathering from shales, for example, that become very clayey, and those clays stick together and they create these long, thick blocks. So have you ever been hiking around San Luis Obispo and you've noticed in the summer these cracks in the ground on the hiking trails? Yes, those are from our vertisols. And what happens, vertisols is a term for a type of soil that we find out here. This is a vertisol, and you see it's a very beautiful dark color, and it has this long, what we call prismatic structure. And the reason that it forms is, like I said, the clays kind of stick together. But what happens with those cracks in the ground is that in the growing season, or in the wet season, excuse me, those clays will grab onto a lot of that water and then they will swell up and expand. And so those cracks will no longer be there in the winter when it's rock is here, and then we've got this little surface soil at the top. So I highly recommend Asterobluffs because you can walk along the bluff there, and then there's lots of locations where you can kind of go down to the beach, and you can turn around and observe the soils behind you. That's what I'm doing. When I'm at the beach, everybody else is like out looking at the ocean, amazing, and I'm like, where's the soil? It's always behind me. And so it's a great opportunity for you to check that out. The second place I recommend visiting, if you're interested in coastal soils, is the Heron Rookery, which is right over there in Windy Cove. Has anybody been over there? My birders? Okay. So this is a soil that I discovered when I was on a bird watching tour for the Moray Bird Festival a couple of years ago, and we were like boating around in the harbor. And of course, I'm looking for birds, but I'm actually looking for soil, as I always am. And I found this one, and now I actually take students out there for a field trip for one of my classes because it's got a better than textbook version of one of these features in the soil that is one of my favorites. So here we've got the soil profile, and I've got a little diagram here. You're walking along the beach, and if you keep going on low tide, you can get kind of all the way to the end of Windy Cove, and you can look back and the soil kind of looks like this. And so this is the Heron Rookery, so we've got cormorants and herons and all kinds of birds roosting up above. And so a lot of this white material here, that's bird guano that's kind of getting deposited on the surface of the soil. It's not snow. But if we zoom in and we look closer at this soil, we find this wonderful feature. And those are lamellae. So this soil is forming in an old sand dune, so ancient sand dunes that have been stabilized by vegetation over time. And there are these thin bands of clay in an otherwise sandy soil. So it's a sand dune, right? It has a sandy texture, it's gritty. But then if you look closely, there are these little thin undulating bands of clay. This is a zoomed in so you can see the bird guano is kind of like sitting on the surface of almost like these little shelves of clay. And here's my hand holding one, very excited to be able to see that. And so the reason that this happens, I know, lamellae is my favorite. So the reason that this happens is there's two mechanisms, two hypotheses for how these form. The first one is that you have some clay that's been deposited from the atmosphere, from wind, deposited on the surface, and then as water washes down through that sandy soil, it picks up the clay and it moves it down, and then it kind of deposits it as it goes. And once the clay sticks together, it forms almost like a mesh. So then when you have more water percolating through it, that mesh will grab onto more clay particles, and over time you'll get this kind of undulating feature. So this is a very well expressed example of lamellae. In other places outside of San Luis Obispo where we find lamellae, they're often really thin, but here we're lucky to have these really nice thick ones, so I hope you can go check it out. The other idea for how these form is when the water has so much clay in it that it can no longer hold on to that clay and it just kind of falls out of solution. And so it's probably both of those things happening at the same time, where the clay is moving down through the profile as the soil gets wet, and it's also kind of moving through that mesh, and then when the water is super saturated with clay, it'll come out of solution as well. So highly recommend checking those out next time you're over at Windy Cove. All right, and the third place, I think we're just right about on time here to visit, is Morro Bay State Park, just on the other side of us over here. Who's walked around the boardwalk? Any of us? Okay, you have walked by this soil. Maybe you've noticed it, but maybe not. So this is a soil here. So we've got, let me just orient us. We've got the rock here, right? And then we're standing, looking towards the marina, and there's the boardwalk behind us. And this exposure right here is what's in that picture there. And so this is a really interesting soil that took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on here, and I ended up contacting the historian for California State Parks because I wanted to know what was the material at the surface. So the first thing that was striking about this soil is that there's this really clear boundary between these two horizons, like it's something on the top and something completely different on the bottom. So on the bottom, we've got these beach sediments. We've got a lot of accumulation of shells. These could be shell middens from the Akitutu tribe to the historian for the California State Parks, I learned about the dredging material, and they had told me that like in the 40s or 50s, they had dredged the marina a couple of different times. And so this anthropogenic material up at the surface, this rocky, craggy part, it's not natural. It's from human deposited. And so this is what we would consider an anthropogenic soil, as you said. And so the reason that we have such a striking boundary between these two is because that material has been deposited by humans. It's not formed by natural processes where it would be like a lot more of a natural gradient between the different horizons, but it's been deposited on top by humans. And so there's actually quite a bit of interest in studying urban and anthropogenic soils because we're creating these novel soil types that didn't exist before from our construction efforts and from, like for this example, dredging of the marina. So you can go check out that soil on your walk around the Marble. All right, so we're about out of time here. If you're interested in learning more about soils, I write a lot about soils. I write a lot of different essays. I also have a newsletter. This is a QR code. If you're interested, you can subscribe to my newsletter. I can tell you more about it later. And I post a lot of that on my website. So if you're curious to learn more about soils, not just about soils in this natural area, I write a lot about desert soils too. I'm kind of like really obsessed with Death Valley, so I write a lot about soils out there. And I'm really interested in helping us develop our relationship with soils in a meaningful way. And so I hope I've convinced you that we are so lucky to live in a place that has such access to beautiful soils around here, and that there are measurements and observations that we can make to help us see soils in a different way. And so this is a little drawing that I made a few years back that is trying to approximate the processes of soil formation because soils grow over time. And one of the things that soils have taught me in my many years studying them is that good things like learning a new skill, like gaining new knowledge, like getting to know your natural environment, it takes time to develop. So hope you'll go out and spend some more time with your local soils, and I'm happy to answer any questions, chat more, or you're welcome to get in touch with me. So thanks for your attention and interest.